Roundabouts and Firewood, a mental health approach for Irish guys. Chapter 10, CBT. Because it was easier for me to shift to part-time, I was the parent who stayed home with Kian. When I did work, I dropped him off at my sister-in-law's house or to a friend whose son I tutored in exchange for babysitting duties. Late and middle of the night feeding was my responsibility. It should have gone smoothly. If a baby cries, you feed him, and then he quits crying and doesn't wake up the full-time worker in the house. Every time Kian woke up in the middle of the night, I'd pick him up, put him on the floor, and then go to the sink to make his bottle. Even though the clean bottles were next to the sink, I'd start wondering if I had rinsed them enough before going to bed. I couldn't convince myself the answer was yes, so I'd start filling one with water and then pour the water out. Just to make sure it was completely absent of liquid detergent, I'd do it again. In the meantime, Kian cried louder. And by the time I was at double digits of rinsing, my wife would get up, take the bottle, feed him, and go back to bed. It was during one of these episodes she suggested that perhaps I might need to see another therapist, maybe a different one, as the rubber band didn't seem to be doing the trick. The second therapist only lasted 2 sessions, as I realized I knew far more about OCD than him. It felt like I was a teacher and he was a student so that later he could treat someone with my problem. In a third attempt to address the issue, I opted to go to an OCD support group at the medical school across town, thinking they'd be doing some groundbreaking research in the area of OCD. There were about 10 people at the meeting, and they all had stories to share. The psychiatrist leading the group said the same thing after each person finished speaking. There's some medication that can really help with that. I thought it was odd that he was so quick to recommend pills after hearing a 2 or 3 minute anecdote. I knew I wasn't going to be helped there. The third therapist was extremely friendly and compassionate. She was great at listening and nodding a lot. Because it was such a warm, positive experience, it took me a while to discover that her technique was to agree with everything I said. You're not going to lose many patients that way, but she did lose me as I chose to end the appointments and head off to a bookstore. There I randomly chose a few OCD books. These only offered redirection strategies along with 200 pages of examples how these redirection strategies work for various patients. Then there was Kian at the age of 4. To him it was simple. If you're afraid of the first item, take it, deal with it, and understand there's nothing to fear. If you're scared that you hit someone, don't turn back and check. Just tolerate the anxiety until it goes away. When you think you touched something, don't go wash your hands 50 times. Accept you'll be okay because you will be okay since you haven't been exposed to anything dangerous. What Kian was doing was introducing me to something that I would be formally introduced to a few months later, cognitive behavioral therapy, commonly referred to as CBT. The basic idea is that you have to change the way you think in order to change the way you feel. Certain thoughts elicit certain feelings. Change your thoughts, and you change the feelings. You can only change the way you think if you practice exposing yourself to things that trigger the obsessions. It was a few months after Kian forced me to take the first item off the shelf that my fourth therapist formally introduced me to CBT. I had gone to the States to train primary teachers, and while I was there, I mentioned to a friend of mine that I was still struggling with OCD, and the only thing helping was Kian pushing me. This friend had been dealing with some anxiety issues of her own and had recently started seeing a therapist that cut through the bullshit and addressed the problem. I gave the therapist a call, explained that I was returning to Ireland in a few days, but I would like to see if she could help me formulate a plan. At her office, she handed me a book, When Panic Attacks by Dr. David Burns, a psychiatrist who was once a student of Dr. Aaron Beck, the father of CBT. During our session, my one-day therapist, Sheila, went over the basics of CBT and how the methods in the book should help. One thing was certain. Exposing myself to things that triggered the obsessions was an essential part of the approach, but I also needed to do daily written work to identify the illogical thoughts, or what are referred to as cognitive distortions. Sheila was clear that while the book could feasibly do the job on its own, continuing therapy with a mental health professional in Ireland would be a good idea. That way, I would be forced to report back to someone every week about the work I was doing. If you don't have a therapist or can't afford one, ask a close friend who you can trust to push you to do the necessary work. And if you don't have a therapist or a friend and happen to be living in a foreign country where you had recently split up with your wife a few months after the move and knew absolutely no one, go to your 4-year-old son for help. We can only work with what we're given. I always knew that I had to face the fears, but with a book full of research by someone who was an expert in CBT and who had developed a number of techniques to address the anxiety, I knew what had to be done. I told Kian about my new book and that it was absolutely essential he didn't let me off the hook. He just had to keep doing what he was doing. I needed to change. Kian already knew I needed to stop being crazy. So telling him to be relentless with me was something he had no problem doing. Since he was going to be relentless, I had two choices: do the hard work or get better at fooling him into thinking I was working harder. It just depended on the day which route I took. Chapter 11. Every Second Day. With me reading when panic attacks and doing the written work, with Kian making the daily demand to stop being crazy, and with renewed optimism that practicing the CBT techniques would make the OCD something of the past, my son and I experienced some relatively successful shopping trips. The majority of the time I grabbed the first item off the shelf, paid for it, and consumed the contents instead of throwing them out. It wasn't easy, but the more I did it, the more the anxiety decreased, and the more courage I gained with all the other things I obsessed about. Fundamental improvement in my thinking and my behavior was actually happening. All I had to do was keep at it every day and things would keep improving. Seems simple enough, but I am human, and like everyone else, I have the capacity to con myself into believing that while one path, daily effort, could get me to the destination of calm sanity, there was another path that I could take that could achieve the same objective. It had been one of those mornings when everything triggered an irrational thought, and instead of employing the CBT protocol, instead of eating something, instead of going for a run, I did nothing but obsess about some made-up danger until it was time to pick up Kian on a Saturday afternoon. After I fastened him in the car, I didn't take him to McDonald's so we could both get something to eat and I could refocus my thoughts. I opted to go straight to Tesco, and I was certain with my son there, I would do the right thing. With Kian watching, I grabbed a package of apples, toothpaste, and a bag of oatmeal. Each time I picked the first one off the shelf without hesitation, and each time the anxiety got worse. It got so bad that I knew that this could be a pivotal day in my pursuit of mental health recovery. If only I could not give in to the obsession, a major victory was close at hand. With this thought in mind, we headed for the sparkling water. To get there, we had to walk down the sweets aisle. Kian, who had been walking beside me, stopped. I turned around to tell him to catch up. But seeing him in awe of all that colorful candy and all those colorful packages, I realized I could give in to my obsessions without him knowing. I walked over to my son and said, "Kian, you can choose 2 different sweets. I'll go grab the water and be right back." "2?" Kian asked to confirm what he thought he had just heard. "Yes, 2. I rushed over to the next aisle, set the basket on the floor, and then sprinted off to get a new one. I then ran down the aisles and grabbed new toothpaste, apples, and oatmeal, each time taking the third item off the shelf. I don't think I took longer than a minute to do all this. When I returned to get him, I asked Kian if he was ready. he told me that he was still working on his second choice. No problem. Take your time. I'll go get the last couple of things. I'll be right back. Again, I sprinted off. I picked up the last few items we needed to make it through the evening and the next morning. When I returned, Kian was still trying to make his second choice, so I helped him make a decision. We walked over to the self-checkout stands, where I scanned and paid for the items I had grabbed without my son's knowledge. Discovering Kian could be distracted by the sweets aisle was not good. I took him shopping with me so I would be forced to deal with some of my anxieties. Now I had found a way to avoid his observing eye. That evening, I should have made a declaration that I would never do it again. I should have told Kian that I had intentionally fooled him and apologized. I did not do that. Instead, I opted for what I thought was a reasonable compromise, but was nothing more than a cowardly rationalization. I decided that it was okay to fool and mislead Kian as long as I didn't do it 2 days in a row. Somehow I had convinced myself that a day on, day off routine was an acceptable way to go about it. I likened it to jogging or weightlifting, a day of working out and a day of rest. But this wasn't physical exercise, and the last thing I needed was a day off. If I did everything right on Monday, like grab the first item off the shelf, put air in my tires without putting on 2 pairs of gloves, or drive through a roundabout without turning around, Tuesday was a sweets day at the shop. I'd start off with a few items in the basket, bring Kian to his favorite aisle, and tell him to choose. Then I'd run off and replace what I had in the basket, sprint back to see his progress, head out for a few more things, return to help him narrow his choices, and soon the pair of us would be walking to the car. On those days, Kian was pleased with his sweets and I was content that I was sticking to my day on, day off plan. I want to be clear about something when it comes to mental health issues. If you are not going forward, you are going backwards, and the backward slide is much more rapid than the forward progress. I did not get this. I was certain that if I did not give into a compulsion one day and then gave into the compulsion the next day, I was getting better. For a couple of months, I was certain I had stumbled onto a tolerable course of recovery. It was only a matter of time before something happened to prove that my trade-off strategy was complete bullshit.